وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So we're on lesson 3 in our reading of Risala al-Khushu'iyya of Imam al-Khadimi. And in the previous lesson, we took the Adab of Salah with a specific focus on wudu and how we can attain khushu' in our ablution. We also discussed how important wudu is, how it's an action that is often neglected by people, and the connection between wudu and Salah. And now, Imam al-Khadimi is going to be discussing the adab of cleanliness. And so over here, there's one important point to take note of before we read what the Imam has to say, which is that what you'll notice is he's still focused on actions that are external to the prayer. He is not discussing ruku and sujood and qira'ah. And this is important to take note of because a lot of times when we ask ourselves the question, how can I cultivate a state of khushu in prayer? We tend to treat prayer as this standalone, independent action that is disconnected from other actions that we might perform in our everyday lives. And this is an incorrect way of looking at actions in general, and it is bound to lead to a failure in trying to attain khushu' in the salah itself. And the reason for this is what the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ teaches us is that the believer is someone who looks at things from a more holistic paradigm. The purpose of the Prophet ﷺ was allow us to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of our moments, in every action that we perform. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ came with guidance regarding even the most mundane of affairs. How to eat, how to sleep, what you say when you enter the bathroom, what foot you use to enter into the bathroom, and what foot you use to enter into the mosque. Actions that we might not even think are very important to our religious practice. But what the Prophet ﷺ is trying to teach us is that the religion cannot be understood as simply a series of disparate actions, where one action has no influence or impact on other aspects and actions that you perform in your daily life. In order to cultivate khushu' and presence of heart and connectedness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within your prayer, you need to cultivate that outside of your prayer as well. You need to recognize that your actions are interconnected and that a deficiency in one aspect or one domain of your life is going to impact on other aspects of your life when it comes to our spiritual states. And so this is a very important lesson that we need to recognize. And we see countless examples of this within the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Look at something like eating halal food, eating food that is licit, that is not doubtful, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted for us. The Prophet ﷺ connected eating of licit food with the acceptance of one's dua. And salah at its core is dua. And so if you're eating food that is haram or that has of doubtful origin, then this is going to have an impact on your spirituality and on your prayer itself. And the ulama throughout history, they've recognized this. And they've recognized how actions that you are performing have an impact and an effect on other actions within your life. And so if you want to have khushu' in prayer, you need to look at what is around you and what you are doing outside of prayer. And then when you recognize your deficiencies and your failings outside of prayer, you can correct those and in the process try to cultivate that presence of heart within the prayer as well. And so we need to look at it from that more holistic perspective. And so with that said, Imam al-Khadimi discusses the adab of cleanliness. And the way he discusses it is that he addresses it by dividing it into two types. Cleanliness, that is aradiyun and tabi'iyun. And the aradi is basically those aspects that do not naturally relate to the body or natural bodily growth. whereas the tabi'i is something that naturally is connected to the body and relates to bodily growth. And this division that he's taking over here is from Imam al-Ghazali in his Ihya al-Ulumuddin. And so we'll just quickly read through what Imam al-Khadimi has to say. Most of it is pretty straightforward, and then we'll try to get into the deeper meaning underpinning this aspect of cleanliness and its adab. So he says, فَالْعَرَضِيُّ ثَمَانِيَةٌ, mentions 8 types. غسل الوجه وترجيله وتدهينه إزالة للشعث غبا. So the first is basically washing the face and combing facial hair and applying cream or oil to it, and doing this occasionally in order to remove oneself from being in a disheveled state. And we know there are specific traditions that report the Prophet ﷺ would tell people who he saw in a disheveled state to go and make themselves look more presentable. إزالة درن السماخ إزالة ما في أذنيه. Then we have removing dirt or wax from the ear, and this relates to both the outer part of the ear and the inner part of the ear canal. إزالة ما في الأنف وما يجتمع على الأسنان وأطراف اللسان ويزيله بالسواك. And then to remove anything that might be found in the nose, such as snot, and what gathers on the teeth in terms of plaque and other things like that in the mouth. And this is removed by way of the siwak. And the siwak was something beloved to the Prophet ﷺ. He said that the siwak was something that purified the mouth and that was pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha said that the Prophet ﷺ always had a siwak nearby. إزالة الوسخ والقمل من اللحية والتشريه بالمشط. And then we have the removal of any dirt or impurities and lice from the beard and combing of the beard. And again, this is a specific sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ would comb his beard and ensure that it was presentable. إزالة وسخ ظهور الأنامل. And then to remove any dirt that might be found on the top of the nails. And then تنظيف رؤوس الأنامل, and then the cleaning the fingertips. وما تحت الأظفار مع الوسخ من الوسخ. And then to clean what might be below the fingernails in terms of any dirt. And كل ذلك أمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And all of this has been commanded by the Prophet ﷺ. And then finally, إزالة الدرن في جميع البدن بنحو الحمام. And then to clean off dirt from the entirety of one's body through a bath. Then he gets into the things that naturally relate to the body. وأما التبعي فأيضا ثمانية. Again, 8. He mentions 8 things over here. حلق الرأس إلا أن يدهن ويرجل. First is to shave the head, unless one applies oil to the hair and combs it. So the Prophet ﷺ said, if you have hair, then honor it. And so Imam al-Khadimi over here is basically indicating that, it's best for you to just simply shave your hair if you're unable to take care of it properly. But if you're able to take care of it properly, such as by applying oil and combing it regularly, then that is what should be done. And then he says, قص الشوارب, trimming the mustache, and نطف الإبط في كل 40, and then to trim or shave the armpit hair after every 40 days or during every 40 days. حلق العانة ولا يتأخر عن 40, and then to also shave the pubic hair, and this should not be, you should not delay this for more than 40 days. قلم الأظفار, and then to trim the fingernails. قطع السرة في أول الولادة, to cut the umbilical cord when a baby is born. الختان, circumcision. and قطع ما طال من اللحية ما زاد القبضة وقال بعضهم تركها أحب, and then to cut the beard or cut that portion of the beard that goes beyond a fistful. And some of the ulama said that simply to leave it is better. Simply to leave the beard grow is better. Now over here, there's an important discussion regarding the fitra. So many of the actions that Imam al-Khadimi has just mentioned relate to human fitra. And the fitra has been defined by the ulama in various ways, that it is the natural disposition upon which the human being was created, that it refers to the sunnah of the Anbiya and the Prophets alayhim salam. And the basis of the fitra is of course established in authentic hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ identified 10 things from the fitra as related in Sahih of Imam Muslim: trimming the mustache, growing the beard, the siwak, rinsing the nose, trimming the fingernails, washing one's knuckles and joints, and plucking one's armpit hair, shaving one's pubic hair, and to wash one's private parts with water, especially after going to the bathroom. And the ulama mentioned there are a lot more aspects of the fitrah, but these are the 10 major aspects of the fitrah, and Imam al-Khadimi mentions them in his Adab of cleanliness. Now over here, there's a deeper meaning to this idea of cleanliness, right? He's not simply trying to give us beauty tips over here. There is a reality to cleanliness that we need to understand. The first thing is, the Prophet ﷺ, what did he say? Inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbul jamal. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beautiful and loves beauty. And the human being on one level is always trying to reflect the divine. And he's always trying to inculcate in himself the attributes that are ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, is eternal, without beginning, without end, beyond time, beyond space. And his sifat are also eternal. And human beings do not resemble Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way, shape, or form. But the ulama do mention this idea of takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, that the human being has the capacity to reflect the attributes of the divine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is merciful, and the human being can be merciful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is shakur. The human being can be the same. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is sabur. The human being can be the same. And so the ulama have a very profound discussion on this particular point. The idea of the divine being perfection and the human being reflecting the divine in various ways. And this is how some of them understood the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that Adam was created on the image of God. Namely, that the human being is the locus of manifestation of the asma of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this idea of cleanliness, this idea of displaying beauty, this idea of displaying purity is in keeping with this idea of the human as a reflection of the divine. So that's the first point. The second point that we need to understand that's related to this is this nexus between the spiritual and the physical. Cleanliness of these very mundane actions, again, that we've taken. Things like trimming your fingernails, not looking disheveled, making sure your beard is tidy and clean. Things that were like, what does this have to do with, okay, it's good to do, but it's not that big of a deal. But the fact of the matter is, it is a very important part of our tradition. And so, in one report, in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, Ibn Abbas reports that the Prophet ﷺ, someone said to the Prophet that Jibreel has delayed himself in terms of coming to you. He's tarried. And so the Prophet ﷺ responded to him, why would he not tarry? Why would he not be delayed in this regard from me? When you who are around me, you are people who you don't trim your fingernails, and you do not trim your mustaches, and you do not keep your private parts clean, and you do not clean your teeth, and so on and so forth. And so over here, what the Prophet is indicating to us is that cleanliness has an effect on the spiritual domain. Because if Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam is refusing or being prevented to come in a particular setting where people are not physically clean, then this shows us the spiritual impact of physical cleanliness on the spiritual. And this is something that is very important to take into account. And again, it goes back to that point of all the actions that we do, one, have a deeper reality, they have a deeper spiritual reality, and they impact our actions, they impact our spiritual states, they impact spiritual realms in ways that we often tend to ignore and we don't recognize. And so physical cleanliness has a very deep connection to our own spiritual well-being and our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reason why the Prophet ﷺ identified these elements of the fitrah, and the reason why he taught his companions physical cleanliness and to remain in a state of beauty, of jamal, and of nadhafa, of cleanliness, is because he understood the spiritual meaning behind these actions. And so, in the context of salah, how can we understand this in the context of salah? Why cleanliness? We've mentioned some of the points that we've mentioned already regarding some of the deeper spiritual realities underpinning cleanliness. But we can mention two things specifically in the context of salah. One is the psychology of cleanliness. And this is a very important idea. The idea that cleanliness has an impact in motivating a person, in focusing his concentration. And studies have shown that people who lack in personal hygiene or people who are in unclean environments, that their productivity falls, their focus falls, they're not able to connect to the actions that they're doing, and so on and so forth. And so the psychology of cleanliness is very important to understand over here. When your body is clean, when you feel good about yourself, when you're wearing nice clothes, then your focus and attention in prayer is also more pronounced. And they have this idea when it comes to clothing. Psychologists mention this. They have this term that you have enclosed cognition, right? They refer to it as enclosed cognition. And so what they're trying to study is not what does the clothing you wear tell about you, but what does the clothing you wear, how does it impact you? And so there's a reason why the Prophet ﷺ, for example, on Jum'ah, he recommended that people wear the best of their clothing, they put on perfume, because it helps you get into that mode where you feel physically uplifted, you feel ready to go to this noble occasion where you are going to be performing prayer and standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there's a psychology behind cleanliness that we need to understand that helps us connect to the prayer better. And secondly, of course, because we are appearing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we mentioned, Allah is someone who is beautiful and loves beauty. And when you are standing in front of the Lord of the worlds, then just as you have to stand with subservience and submission and humility, you do not go in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a state where you are disheveled, where you are dirty, where you are unclean, where you are impure. And this is why the ulama, for example, they would dislike people praying in clothing that they would not wear in front of others. or to perform prayer in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a disheveled and dirty state. These were actions that the ulama deemed disliked. And so this is why the adab of cleanliness becomes very crucial to the salah. Because one, it impacts our state of mind within the prayer, it impacts our motivation, our focus, and concentration in the prayer. It impacts the mode that we enter into prayer with and our readiness for it. And secondly, because cleanliness is demanded by the act of prayer, being a standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so hopefully that was of some benefit, and inshallah with that we will end this session. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.